Yeah, I have. Not to mention, there was a time that I was, Keel had mentioned about these things coming through the radios, the police radios down in West Virginia. The night that these people were being interrogated about in in let's see, in November, I think 15th, 1966, the two young couples that had seen Mothman in the TNT area, and a policeman was interviewing them later, and this high-speed sounding voice came through the police radio. And then Keel experienced that later in around April 67 when he was taking some police officers to a location where he had seen this craft up close the night before. And the police radio was turned off at the time, but these voices came through, and he described them again as being kind of high-pitched and very fast, and like they're talking real fast. And and the police officer was there that was in the TNT area and said, that sounds like what I heard that night when I was talking to these two young couples. And it got me to thinking, so I did a session where I wanted to ask if they were the same kind of things that we hear over the ghost box. And as I was about to say, high-speed EVP, this voice comes across saying what sounded like this, EVP.
Oh, wow.
And, I hadn't even just got it out yet, And I know that, months after, we'd started getting John Keel, I was playing back that audio from March of 2010 when I was first with a group working with the Spirit Box, and I hadn't told anybody, or the Ghost Box, I hadn't told anybody about, wanting to reach out to John Keel. This was all in my head. But there was a section toward the end where Brett Oldham was asking that a late brother to my wife, Joan, could come through. They were fixing to wind up the session, so if you have something to say, you'd like to say your name, go ahead. And his name was Jesse. So months later, I happened to find this cassette tape. At that time, I was using cassette. Afterwards, I started doing digital. But I put it in the recorder, and I'm hearing the Ghost Box. Okay, this is that first session I went to. And it was right at the end, and it just so happened it said, can you have Joan's brother say his name? So I'm waiting to hear Jesse. And instead I hear Keel, Johnny, and I hadn't heard that before. And and then there was like an argument, and it was a mad male voice. It wasn't as clear as the Keel Johnny, but I asked my wife to listen to it with the headphones, and it sounded like he was using a cuss word. And I said, Joan, does that sound like your brother? And she listened and nodded, said, yeah, it does. She said, but I've never heard him use that kind of language before. I says, yeah, but he used to go to bars. I think he probably did. But anyway, we just, I said, that was the area that he was supposed to say his name. And this Keel Johnny came in there and said his name instead. And it might have caused a little problem there. So anyway, so there's the two things that come to mind right there.
Now, I got a question. People are chatting here with me as you're talking. Some people are asking what and who are Mothman. So can you explain that to the listeners, the basics of what they are and the legend behind it?
Okay, well, Mothman started in and around Point Pleasant, West Virginia. Back in, actually, there was two couples in an area north of Point Pleasant, several miles at an old ammunition center, World War II ammunition center. They call it TNT plant nearby, and it's many acres, and they had these kind of look like Indian mounds. Now they're grown over, but they they called them igloos. They were shelters, concrete shelters where they put ammunition in and such, and they manufactured ammunition back during World War II, and stored it there. And they would have them looking kind of like Dina Indian mounds, and I guess so that people flying over, enemy maybe flying over, wouldn't know what it really was. But anyways, it was there that this young couple had this encounter with this being with red eyes, stood about 6 or 7 feet tall, had wings, and scared the bejeebers out of them. They got in this Roger Scarberry's car and flew down 62, headed back toward Point Pleasant, and this thing flew down over the car, and it was flapping its wings just over the car, and they could see the wings on one side of the car. At the same time, they would see the other wing on the other side of the car, just right over the roof. And they got into town, and they went right straight to the police station and reported it to an officer there. And he felt that something had happened to him that scared him a lot. They also said there was, when they were going into town, there was a dog on the side of the road, a dead dog, and when they came back, the dog was gone. They always kind of wondered about that. But after that, there were other sightings, and John Keel heard about these kind of things and that were going on. So he came soon after these two young couples. They were like 19, 20 years of age. And it was, of course, a big news story at the time. At first it was called The Bird by the locals, and then the Batman series was real popular at the time, and some journalists decided to call it The Mothman. And so he came into town and started interviewing people and struck up an acquaintance with a local journalist named Mary Heyer. And she kept him informed of things. And he made, I think, about 5 trips to Point Pleasant altogether, investigating their sighting and others. There were about 100 people he interviewed, Mothman and kind of a Bigfoot type thing, different kind of cryptids that were being reported in the area, actually, along with UFO activity that he found to be quite an active area. And so the movie kind of, changed a lot of things. It said, it had John Keel with his wife that, had a sighting, and of course John Keel wasn't married, and John Keel never dove into the Ohio River after to save a sheriff, a flighty sheriff. And so none of that happened, but he did tell me on the phone that the part where the phone was unplugged from the wall, but it was ringing, did happen. And, there was a lot of anomalous stuff, and of course the movie was based on that, but he said he had told he was happy with it. He said that there was no way that they could have taken the Mothman prophecies and made it into a 2-hour movie and it to be entertaining, because there was so many separate stories. So they had to present it in a way that it was entertaining and incorporate all of the elements together. And he had told this literary agent, he was all excited one day, she said, and I talked with her, and she was recalling how he was very happy with the outcome of the movie, the script, because at the time he was actually reviewing scripts, and he rejected a lot of them. But this one guy sent in one that, even though it had all these things that were different, he said it captured the feeling, it captured the heart of the story, and so that's what they ended up with. And
Brent, I have a follow-up to your wonderful rendition, by the way, of the Mothman prophecy story. That for the young ufologists out there, or those folks that are interested in the paranormal, that is a classic story, a classic book and movie, so they have to review that if they don't know about it. But I just wanted to mention, just this last March at the Quinault Beach Paranormal Festival down in Ocean Shores, Washington, our UFO I team was present there and doing a presentation. And one of our things is we ask people to tell us their story, and we get it on tape. And also, we have a forensic sketch artist who is just very, very good, and he will actually create what people have seen and be able to really put down exactly what they're talking about and put it in a form that they can show others what they've seen, because they've never been able to do that because with just a sighting in their own senses. But one of the sketches that Brian Snowdy, our forensic sketch artist, came up with that weekend, which is not even a year ago at this point, was an exact, almost replica of the Mothman. And when I asked the witness of this event whether he knew anything about John Keel or the Mothman, he never even had heard of John Keel or the Mothman prophecies. And he describes this giant being with wings, red glowing eyes as well, just as if it came right out of the book.
Well, that's interesting. I just, a few years ago, I went to the Mothman Festival. An old friend of mine who I hadn't seen in 40 years, Stan Gordon from Greensburg, Pennsylvania, was there. He had a table, and he was doing a talk at the local theater. And he had a new book out, and he showed me where he had this story and an artist sketch of this Mothman-type creature seen around Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, around the time Mothman was being seen in West Virginia back in the 60s. But, the people there and around Pittsburgh didn't know about what was going on at the time in Point Pleasant, West Virginia. And I had called up Keel one time because I found out a few years back there was, when he was still alive, there was, this might have been around 2006, 2007, and there had been some reports of crop circles over around Madisonville over here in eastern Tennessee. And I contacted an editor of the paper, to find out a little more information. And he was telling me about people seeing a disc-shaped object around the same time this crop circle had appeared. And he had one of the people actually call me up and share her experience with me. And it was sort of a double convex disc with lights around the outer rim, kind of the classic, And there were 3 people that saw the same thing. And come to find out, they'd had this very large bird that would fly around. He'd seen it twice, back in the 60s, 70s, and I think into the 80s. And by this time, when I was talking to her, it was kind of like local folklore. He said he'd tell his grandkids about it, and before bedtime, they were always interested in hearing the story, But he said at the time, this was pretty serious. And he said some people said it would actually land and walk like a man and stood about 6 or 7 feet. And I says, you know what? I says, it sounds like you have the same thing as the Mothman. And, and he said, well, I hadn't thought about it, but, and I said, Tennessee, underneath, Kentucky and West Virginia, as the Mothman might fly, it might not be too far, And
right.
He said there were a lot of stories about it back in the day, and then there was I was in touch with somebody out in place in southern New Mexico, almost into Texas. In fact, he worked for in a courthouse down there in El Paso. I think it was El Paso. And anyway, he wrote me about some sightings in his area. And one was so close. The guy was out at night. He was a truck driver, and he saw this thing that flew down and landed right by him. He had a dog with him that he was taking out to relieve itself, and it sort of got behind him. But he had his lighter, and he would flick it, and he would catch glimpses of this thing, and he said it was, it was a winged thing that stood, I think, about as tall as a man. It had fangs. It's something you don't want to encounter up close. And luckily it turned around and flew and landed on this guy's, the roof of his garage, and then continued off into the mountains. But he went over one night, and interviewed the guy for me. So I got to hear this interview and recorded it